Hey guys, Greg Chaplin, Doctor of Physical Therapy and Strength and Conditioning Specialist. And I've got my buddy Mr. Phibbs here to talk about uneven hips and hip hike and how we can actually alleviate and improve this position in one simple exercise. So first and foremost, what we mean by uneven hips or hip hike is we have the visual appearance of one side coming up relative to the other. You're gonna see this mainly in the context of standing or walking. So we could zoom in and look at the position of the hip and the range of motion, and then we could design a very specific exercise on the floor, and we can totally do that. But I think we can actually look at this a little bit more simply by understanding what the function of this hip hike is. Then once we understand what it's trying to accomplish and how that differs from normal, then we can actually use a very, very simple exercise that we're going to go over in this video to be able to restore the strategy that we want and start doing less of the strategy that we don't. So with that being said, when we look at this hip hike, what we're really doing here is we're actually trying to propel ourselves off of the side that we're hiked on towards the other side. And the way that we would do this in a normal biomechanical context would be to push down through the ground and access a joint position and strategy of internal rotation. When we don't have access to that, what we do instead is we tend to hike the hip up and arch the back so that we begin to try to turn away from that side of the hip hike. So what we need to do to be able to restore an even position of the hips is to learn how to restore that normal strategy of pushing down through the ground by actually reaching that pelvis down, pushing down through the ground by using the hips and keeping this area a little bit more relaxed. Now, to understand how exactly we're gonna do that, we need to understand something about human movement, specifically within what we call the gait cycle. So the gait cycle, if you're not familiar, is just how we're walking through space, and we can really break these down into phases. All right, so when we're walking and we go to load over one side of the body, we have three phases that happen. When we're behind the foot, this is called the early stance phase, and here the leg's gonna be a little bit turned out into external rotation, and we're gonna be a little bit turned away from that side. So if I'm bearing weight through the right, I'd be turned towards the left. As we come over that side, we square the torso and hips to the front. We're going to be stacked over that foot, and this is where we push into the ground through a little bit of internal rotation at the hip and pelvis, and then we transfer from that to then load the other side in the late stance phase. So if we want to be able to alleviate or improve this uneven hip or hip hiked position, we need to be able to get into this mid stance phase of gait where internal rotation is going to help us push into the ground without doing it through arching the back, but instead do it by reaching the pelvis down, keeping a slightly bent knee, and then using the muscles of the hip to push straight down into the ground into internal rotation. So just kind of imagine here, if I'm on the right side and the left side is now swinging forward, I want to be able to push into the ground through internal rotation of that hip and pelvis by keeping it down and not letting it hike up and turn over like this. So we're going to think about reaching that side down while we push down using those hip muscles. All right, so now that we understand that, we're just going to create an exercise that simulates that position. So to do that, we know that we need to be stacked over that side. So we're gonna have nice even pressure in the foot, a little bit more towards the back than the front. We're gonna have a slight bend in the knee. Then we're gonna have head, rib cage, and pelvis all stacked over that side with the low back here nice and relaxed. Now from there, we're gonna put that other foot in front just on the ground for a little bit of balance. We're gonna reach forward with the hand of the same side, in this case the right, and back with the hand of the opposite side. So here we stack, we get nice pressure over that heel, reach forward with the right, back with the left. Nice long exhale. We engage the muscles here in the core and those obliques a little bit as we drive down through the ground by using the muscles of the hip. It's important that you keep the knee nice and relaxed as you're doing this, and make sure you keep that weight distribution over the heel with your low back nice and relaxed. We're going to repeat that sequence, inhaling once again, feeling the rib cage expand front to back, and then exhaling as we reach further forward with the right, backward with the left. Once again, kind of reaching that hip down and pushing into the ground using the muscles of the hip while keeping a slight bend in the knee. One last breath, inhale. Nice expansion in the rib cage, exhale. Pushing down with a slight bent knee. And to really check that you have this, you should be able to lift that other leg up and pretty much be completely balanced over this side, once again with a slightly bent knee and a nice stacked position. Now I would recommend that even if this was the side you had the hike on, I'd recommend that you do both sides, because often a lack of internal rotation on one side might be for a different reason than the other, and the hike on one side could be responding to an issue with the opposite side. Now in terms of how often to do this, it depends on how quickly you can acquire this skill. This skill requires you to be able to balance front to back and keep your back nice and relaxed while engaging your core, which is a foundational skill that you might find is easier to practice in a more symmetrical context first, or a more supported context first, before you can then integrate it into what we talked about in this video. If that's the case for you, you might want to consider joining one of my programs where you can build some of these foundational skills in more controlled ways and then progress into this more advanced variation. But if you were that person who did this and you noticed an immediate improvement, then I would say you're good to start to integrate some of this awareness into your daily activities and your training activities. So it's something that you could feel for when you're doing your standing, or you're on a break from your work and you're walking, or when you're in the gym and you're doing things like squats, split squats, deadlifts, or even machine-based things, right? We want to think about the kind of checklist we talked about, which is nice even foot pressure, stacked position over that foot, a little bit of a bent knee, reaching down with the pelvis, engaging the muscles of the hip versus the muscles of the back. If you can do that, you're going to be golden, and you don't really have to practice this necessarily in an isolated fashion. But with that said, I don't think you can go wrong with just doing a couple reps of this, maybe every morning for several weeks, and just get the feel of what those differences are left to right. And as you feel those start to get a little bit better and you see the visual appearance improving as well, then you can kind of taper back and stop practicing quite as much. All right, so if you have any other questions, leave them down below in the comments. If you found this video helpful, like it, share it. If you haven't already, subscribe. Do all the things that help the algorithm to help me help more people. And as always, thanks a lot for watching. So until next time, peace.